for an hour and then set the bar. Yeah, and then we got crackers.
It's pretty good, actually.
Yeah, they did the, well, the actual nutcracker. They did the original sugar and then the sugar from Terry's house. It's different.
At least it wasn't like, Nutcracker meets Alice in Wonderland.
Wizard of Oz.
The Pinball Wizard or something. I don't like it when they do that, like, Nutcracker, I like it. Yeah. Yeah. I just got back to it after struggling with the first tummy things and now head cough. Not bad. I feel okay by about 2 weeks. By like 6, like that.
So I borrowed it.
Well, I got no idea. Well, yeah, that's kind of thing. So on the way back, my flights got canceled. And I can't go to the first time to go to work. I had to go to green up Portland, Seattle. You got overnight in Seattle for like 6 hours. So they all piled us up in this overnight out road, but the gates just like closed down. We're all over there. I woke up and well, Big Andy, I was just sitting out sleeping on it, it's like a rushing worked up. He stands up and he's like, oh, yeah. He threw up all the way back in the corner. Didn't wake anybody up, didn't wake his parents up. So, right now, like, and then he just kind of cleans himself up and lays back down and goes to sleep. I'm like, they want to move. Yeah, so, that was like, like it open. I'm working on Thursday, so I work on Friday, and on Friday, I was throwing so I can see. That's kind of cool. Yeah, that was my, yeah, I got to see his last game. Perfect, exactly. The criteria, you win. At first, I was a little worried.
This is the family's already home. This is what this is the family's already home.
This number, it doesn't have much to be a vote.
Are you wrapped up? Morning, Dan.
You ready?
Went flying.
Oh, good.
Everything was great. Perfect.
When you, what day you got on slip? Ah, okay. Yeah. I flew up to Willow on Friday.
Yeah, they're hoping.
Yeah, everything worked great. I can tell you, I got this tail ski on.
Yeah, you were saying that.
Yeah. Yeah, it was easy peasy. The only thing that was hard was getting it back on me.
Yeah.
You come around and you kind of get turned around, then you pick the tail up and get it partially around. Then when I hooked onto my winch, it started pulling back. It was like wanting to pull this wing over too far. So pull and go away. Pull to get it more centered up into the center. So I'm gonna rig up another fan so that with a shiv, so I can pull
Pull it sideways.
pull it side to side.
Oh, interesting, it doesn't go straight.
Well, it will. But when you come in, what I need to do is actually plow that out. Take it from completely out of the way and just make it level, so that I can actually make a big circle in there.
Oh, okay.
Then, if I come around and get lined up like that. But I was like, this, and it's actually gonna really keep going.
Okay.
So that when you put a tail around, you gotta see the bones out there. So that's why the side areas, as I
You don't put it far out, it's easy, maybe like, nose up and hang, and then just pick the tail up, turn it around.
If there's enough snow and ice, so it's soft.
Yeah. That could be.
Anyways, you know, anybody else? I haven't. Send me the email. Oh, my big bench. Okay, thank you. Thank you. You're welcome. Wow. Just checking here.
Hey, Gail, there's two boys out there that can help you. Leave the mate, find her from the first school.
What is the cover is?
It's gotta be here somewhere. Somebody used it for a footstool. It's probably in the back. Maybe it's down by the stairs.
We're going to try.
Where did you see that? There it is.
In there, they just, yeah, use it for stamina and stuff, and I never see it
Right there, Grimlock Hill.
make sure it's for that.
Find it? Good job.
Oh, they put all, I think they're being thorough and trying to clean up. Here's some more.
Thank you, guys.
Are these anyone else's?
All right. Do we have any announcements before we get started on our Bible class today? We're going to be looking at both 2 Chronicles 27 and 28 because 27 is a really short chapter. Is he a little under the weather? Okay, John's a little under the weather. That's been going around.
Quite a bit better.
Quite a bit better, yeah.
And my mom's finally had things from the corner for bronchitis,
Okay.
so things are.
All right. Well, let's have a word of prayer and then we'll get started. We'll start with 2 Chronicles chapter 27 and then when we're done with that, we'll move into 28. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity we have to gather here, look at your word, look at the history of your people, and to learn from that, open our minds and help us to learn from these words, help this class to be useful, help us to figure out more about you and how these lessons apply to our lives. Thank you for this congregation, this group of Christians that can meet here and study at this time. Be with those that have been mentioned in our announcements and among their numbers that are dealing with various issues, medical concerns, those traveling. Be with our friends and relatives that are doing likewise, and those within the community that are dealing with problems. Be with those that have suffered loss recently. Thank you for all the things you've blessed us with. All these prayers and thanks we give in Jesus' name. All right, 2 Chronicles 27. No. There we go. 2 Chronicles 27. It's a short chapter. It's 9 verses. It's about Jotham. But if we went back to 2 Kings, we would find that 2 Kings gives Jotham 6 verses, not 9 verses. So either way, nobody had a whole lot to say about him. So it's a pretty short story. Part of the reason it's short is because there's not a huge amount of either good or bad things. There's fairly neutral, probably one of the shortest stories of the kings of Judah. And this was Uzziah's son. We'd studied about Uzziah last week. And the Chronicle calls him Uzziah, and sometimes it's a little confusing because in Kings he's referred to as Amaziah. But his father was smote with leprosy. There are some questions regarding Jotham's number of years he reigned, because some people think it counts the time that he was reigning in his father's stead. Well, his father was a leper before he actually became king. Other people think that's wrong. We do know he was doing some of the reigning while his father had leprosy. We just don't know if that's included in the timeline, because 2 Kings 15:5 says, "And the Lord smote the kings that he was a leper unto the day of his death, and dwelt in a several house. And Jotham, the king's son, was over the house and judging the people of the land." So that's kind of the background of Jotham. I'll go ahead and read this chapter, and we'll look at the parallel passages in Kings to see what we can find out about Jotham. Jotham was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name also was Jerusha, the daughter of Zadok, and he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father Uzziah did. Howbeit he entered not into the temple of the Lord, and the people did yet corruptly. He built the high gate of the house of the Lord, and on the wall of Ophel he built much. Moreover, he built cities in the mountains of Judah, and in the forest he built castles and towers. He fought also with the king of the Ammonites and prevailed against them. And the children of Ammon gave him the same year 100 talents of silver, 10,000 measures of wheat, and 10,000 of barley. So much did the children of Ammon pay unto him, both the second year and the third. So Jotham became mighty, because he prepared his way before the Lord his God. Now the rest of the acts of Jotham, and all his wars and his ways, lo, they are written in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah. He was 25 years old when he began to reign, and reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. And Jotham slept with his fathers, and they buried him in the city of David, and Ahaz his son reigned in his stead. So, fairly short story. Any particular questions that anybody has about Jotham? There are a couple things that I came up with that I've read this in the past, but typically reading it as it's worded in the King James. Verse 2 changes a little bit, but first, the only other things I found that people really spend a lot of time discussing, like I said, I mentioned they don't know if the 16 years of his reign included the time solely that he was king, or if it included the time when he was reigning before his father died, but had leprosy. The other thing was, it says his mother's name is Jerusha, the daughter of Zadok. Some people think, yes, that could have been the daughter of Zadok. Other people are like, Zadok the priest was a few chapters back. This may just mean the descendant of Zadok and not an actual daughter, something more like a granddaughter or something. But it does appear to be a relative, at least. His mother was a descendant of Zadok the priest. And in verse 2 in particular, the King James says, "And he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father Uzziah did. Howbeit he entered not into the temple of the Lord, and the people did yet corruptly." I'd always read it that way, and worded that way, it makes it sound like he never entered the temple. And so I was thinking that was a very negative thing to say about him. Looking at most commentary on this, and also many other translations, they add like a comma or they put that in parentheses, and that it kind of completely changes the way it sounds when you read it the different ways. The way that the majority of people are taking that to mean is he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father Uzziah did. However, he did not enter the temple. meaning, because that was Uzziah's shortcoming. For those of you that weren't here last week, that's when he was struck with leprosy, was when he entered the temple to burn the incense to the Lord, which was the priest's job, not his job. The way it's worded, I looked at the Hebrew, and of course that's something that, unless you're a Hebrew expert, it didn't really do me any good to look at it, because there's this sentence structure that's worded and things are in different places than they would be in English. It's like, well, that doesn't help. So I looked at a bunch of different translations, and the majority of the translations either read enough different or add parentheses that it does appear that it is indicating he did all that his father Uzziah did, except he did not enter the temple of the Lord. And so it sounds like they may be referring to the fact that he did not follow after his father in that negative way. And that is not mentioned in Kings, the part about him entering into the temple of the Lord. But the author of Kings, although it mentioned that Uzziah was stricken by the Lord with leprosy, it doesn't tell the story of how that happened. And so there'd be no reason to put this caveat if he entered not into the temple of the Lord, and that is not recorded in Kings. Although in Kings, it says just like it did here, and yet the people did corruptly. So I suppose it could mean either thing, but considering that for the most part it's saying positive things about him, although society was turning away from the Lord, like I said, I don't know. I certainly always used to take it as he never entered the temple. And now, having studied it a little bit this weekend, I'm kind of like, well, no, actually it does seem to indicate that more that he didn't enter the temple like his father did, which would not necessarily preclude him from having ever entered the temple, which would seem like a fairly negative thing. We could see the parallel story in 2 Kings. It's chapter 15, starting in verse 32 through the end of the chapter, is the parallel passage. It says, in the second year of Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, began Jotham, the son of Uzziah, king of Judah, to reign. 25 years old was he when he began to reign, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Jerusha, the daughter of Zadok. And he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord. He did according to all that his father Uzziah had done. Howbeit the high places were not removed, and the people sacrificed and burnt incense still in the high places. He built the higher gate of the house of the Lord. Now the rest of the acts of Jotham, and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? In those days the Lord began to send against Judah Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah. And Jotham slept with his fathers, and was buried with his fathers in the city of David his father, and Ahaz his son reigned in his stead. So that's kind of the stories that we have about Jotham. As you could see there from the wording in Kings, it sounds even better than the wording in Chronicles. He did build some higher gates. And of course, his father had been heavily into reinforcing the city. And a lot of scholars believe that plays out fairly heavily in the next king that we're going to look at, Ahaz, who was under attack. And also there in Kings, we see a little bit of a precursor to the story that we're going to get into in the next chapter. In that it says that Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, began to come against Judah. In Chronicles, that is not recorded until Ahaz. So scholars are not sure. They're like, well, they, in Kings, list it with Jotham. So whether they were beginning that alliance and starting to march in Jotham's final days, and most of the battles did not occur under Jotham, but under his son. That is one possible thing. The other possibility is that Jotham, was able to repel the military advances against him. And so it wasn't really recorded in Chronicles in the same way. Either way, it gives It does give us a little bit of an example here as we're going to start into 2 Chronicles 28, and it describes King Ahaz, and we get into these military problems, that those probably happened very quickly. There isn't a period of anything going well under Ahaz. These problems very likely, because of what it said in Kings, started as soon as Ahaz took the throne. So, any final questions about Jotham before we move on to the next chapter? All right. The next chapter is, as I said, about Ahaz. He was not a good king, and he will start a cycle that we'll pretty much see where it's bad king, good king, bad king, good king. You know, at least with the last two kings, we had two kind of good kings, but you know, aside from the leprosy thing, we're definitely going to get into some really. This guy's just absolutely bad. And what's interesting about this is that they record the stories so differently in 2 Chronicles versus 2 Kings. Most of the time you go look in the two books and you read about these kings, it's like, yep, that's the same story for sure. This one, the sections of the story, you could see these people marched against him and he sacrificed to these gods. That all lines up. But they actually tell the story very differently. So there's obviously a lot of story there, and one author chose to tell one part of the story, and another one chose to tell another part of the story. But it definitely is very confusing going back and forth. But definitely the events sort of line up, so you can tell they're telling the same story, but they're not even picking the same parts of the story to tell. So there's definitely a lot. There were definitely a lot of stories under Ahaz's time. And like I said, they're not good stories. They're really. So we'll start in on 2 Chronicles 28. And the parallel chapter to this is an actual whole chapter. It's 2 Kings 16. And I will just read this through all the way. Ahaz was 20 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. But he did not that which was right in the sight of the Lord, like David his father. For he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, and made also molten images for Balaam. Moreover, he burnt incense in the valley of the son of Hinnom, and burnt his children in the fire, after the abominations of the heathen, whom the Lord had cast out before the children of Israel. He sacrificed also, and burnt incense in the high places, and on the hills, and under every green tree. Wherefore the Lord his God delivered him into the hands of the king of Syria. And they smote him, and carried away a great multitude of them captives, and brought them to Damascus. And he was also delivered into the hand of the king of Israel, who smote him with a great slaughter. For Pekah, the son of Remaliah, slew in Judah 120,000 in one day, which were all valiant men, because they had forsaken the Lord God of their fathers. And Zikri, a mighty man of Ephraim, slew Maaseiah, the king's son, and Azrikam, the governor of the house, and Elkanah, that was next to the king. And the children of Israel carried away captive of their brethren 200,000, women, sons, and daughters, and took also away much spoil from them, and brought the spoil to Samaria. But a prophet of the Lord was there, whose name was Oded, and he went out before the host that came to Samaria, and said unto them, Behold, because the Lord God of your fathers was wroth with Judah, he hath delivered them into your hands, and ye have slain them in a rage that reacheth up unto heaven. And now ye propose to keep under the children of Judah and Jerusalem for bondmen and bondwomen unto you? But are there not with you, even with you, sins against the Lord your God? Now hear me, therefore, and deliver the captives again, which ye have taken captive of your brethren. For the fierce wrath of the Lord is upon you. Then certain of the heads of the children of Ephraim, Azariah the son of Jehonan, Berechiah the son of Meshillemoth, and Jaakiah the son of Shallum, and Amasa the son of Hadalai, stood up against them that came from the war, and said unto them, Ye shall not bring in the captives hither. For whereas we have offended against the Lord already, ye intend to add more to our sins and to our trespasses? For our trespass is great, and there is fierce wrath against Israel. So the armed men left the captives and the spoil before the princes and all the congregation. And the men which were expressed by name rose up and took the captives with the spoil, clothed all that were naked among them, and arrayed them and shod them, and gave them to eat and to drink, and anointed them, and carried all the feeble of them upon asses, and brought them to Jericho, the city of the palm trees, to their brethren. Then they returned to Samaria. And at that time did King Ahaz send unto the kings of Assyria to help him. For again the Edomites had come and smitten Judah, and carried away captives. The Philistines also had invaded the cities of the low country, and of the south of Judah, and had taken Beth Shemesh, and Ajalon, and Girdoth, and Shako, and the villages thereof, and Timnah with the villages thereof, and Gimzo also, and the villages thereof, and they dwelt there. For the Lord brought Judah low because of Ahaz, king of Israel, for he made Judah naked, and transgressed sore against the Lord. And Tilgath-Pileser, king of Assyria, came unto him, and distressed him, but strengthened him not. For Ahaz took away a portion out of the house of the Lord, and out of the house of the king, and of the princes, and gave it unto the king of Assyria, but he helped him not. And in the time of his distress he did trespass yet more against the Lord. This is that king Ahaz. For he sacrificed unto the gods of Damascus, which smote him. And he said, Because the gods of the king of Syria helped them, therefore will I sacrifice to them, that they may help me. But they were the ruin of him and all Israel. And Ahaz gathered together the vessels of the house of God, and cut in pieces the vessel of the house of God, and shut up the doors of the house of the Lord, and made him altars in every corner of Jerusalem. And in every several city of Judah he made high places to burn incense unto other gods, and provoked to anger the Lord God of his fathers. Now the rest of his acts and all of his ways, first and last, behold, they are written in the book of the kings of Judah and Israel. And Ahaz slept with his fathers, and they buried him in the city, even in Jerusalem. But they brought him not into the sepulchres of the kings of Israel. And Hezekiah his son reigned in his stead. So, all in all, a pretty terrible king. Like I said, some of the interesting things to me about this is this whole story that takes a fairly large part of this chapter of how the captives were carried away, and the prophet Oded, which it's worth noting that Oded is never mentioned anywhere else that I could find. This seems to be what we know about him, is that he was a prophet of the Lord in the northern 10-tribe kingdom of Israel, that told them they had sinned against the Lord by bringing their brothers, fellow Israelites, captive. And to me, this story is kind of ironic. As we're going through a Chronicles here, the Chronicle is only looking at Judah. So unlike in Kings, we're not hearing much about the northern kingdoms and Israel. We do get mentions, though. For example, one of the things Ahaz is criticized is that he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel. He followed after their abominations. And Israel, for the most part, was doing so much worse than Judah. Their religious practices were definitely, way worse, or at least had been worse for much longer. And so you have this kind of negative opinion of Israel, and you get to this story, and the 10 tribes have carried away their brothers captive from Judah, and this prophet of God meets him and says, "Oh, you shouldn't do this. This is sinful." And they're like, "Okay, we won't do it." And they actually obey the prophet. And it's just kind of like, wow, where did that come from? So that's kind of interesting. And this story is not recorded in Kings at all. It's only here in Chronicles that they had these captives, and the prophet came and told them not to keep the captives. And so they're like, okay, we'll turn them loose. They clothe the naked. They give them all clothes and shod them. They give them shoes for the journey. The ones that can't walk, they put them on donkeys, and they take them back to Jericho, which would be just across the border into their own land. And like, well, here you go. We won't keep captives. So, excuse me, that's interesting. And also, in contrast, this almost seems to be a different battle, because in Kings it records a battle where they go against Ahaz in Jerusalem, and they were not able to prevail against it, it says. So some have questioned, is this the same battle? And in this battle, we see that they slew the king's son, the governor, and the man next to the king. So they came really close, but they never got to the king. Is that what the author of Kings means when it says they didn't prevail against him? Or was this actually a separate battle, and these were military campaigns that one is telling a story about one campaign and the other author is telling another story? I can't really tell, but those are the two thought processes that most scholars have, is either they really have a different view of it, or this military campaign had multiple things and both happened and they're actually just completely separate stories. The rest of the stories in the chapter after that do tend to match up. They aren't exactly described the same way. For example, here starting in verse 16, it says, "At that time did King Ahaz send unto the kings of Assyria to help him. For again the Edomites had come and smitten Judah and carried away captives. And the Philistines also had invaded the cities of the low country and the south of Judah, and had taken Beth Shemesh and Ajalon and Girdoth and all these different villages there." And in verse 19 it says, "For the Lord had brought Judah low because of Ahaz king of Israel. For he made Judah naked and transgressed sore against the Lord. And Tilgath-Pileser, king of Assyria, came unto him and distressed him, but strengthened him not. For Ahaz took away a portion out of the house of the Lord, and out of the house of the king and the princes, and gave it unto the king of Assyria, but he helped him not." Now, what's ironic about this is recorded in Kings. The fact that he paid tribute to the king of Assyria. He gathered all kinds of treasure out of the temple, it's recorded. He gave it to the king of Assyria and said, "I am your servant and your son. You know, here's this huge amount of treasure. I'll be a vassal state to you." But here it says he didn't help him. And in the story in Kings, he actually went and wiped out the city of Damascus and killed Rezin, king of the Syrians. So there's some controversy there. It's like, well, it does seem like he helped him. But in reading here in Chronicles, it says that the particular problem that the chronicler is mentioning, the Edomites, the Philistines, all these cities that had been taken, he didn't help him at all with that. So it's somewhat accurate. It's like he did not help him in regard to these things. And he took all this treasure from him and all this tribute from him. And so in the long run, he probably didn't really help him. And so both can be accurate, but it just seems like a discrepancy, because he did do some things that at least temporarily helped Ahaz out. And also, if you read that story, here continuing in Chronicles, it mentions that in this time of distress, he trespassed yet more against the Lord, and he sacrificed unto the gods of Damascus. Well, that story is recorded in Kings. He goes to Damascus to meet and pay tribute to the kings of Assyria that he has paid to help him, and they've conquered Damascus. And this is even recorded in historical writings outside of Scripture, this particular meeting with the king in Damascus. And we'll look at it in a moment, but while he's in Damascus, he sees this altar that he really likes. And he's so taken with it that he's like, "Build me a copy of that. I'm going to offer all my sacrifices on that." So it appears the story is told a little differently, but it appears this story in the very last part of this chapter of he started sacrificing to the gods of Damascus. That story is told, and it is in connection to his paying tribute to the Assyrians. So any questions before we go look at the parallel passage in Kings?
Second Kings, They give more detail into the altars and.
Mm-hmm.
Here they just say they built it exactly like it, but there they really go into detail.
Right. It does really go into it, but it's like, oh yes, this is the same story. They're just telling different details about it. And that part, that is where you can kind of look and be like, yeah, this is definitely the same story with these kings. It's just, it is funny that it says he helped him not, whereas you read this story in Kings, it kind of sounds like he helped him, but I guess that's a matter of perspective. But you do see this, him accepting the worship from Damascus, and it's like, well, okay, definitely not good. But anyway, before we run out of time, I'll move on and read 2 Kings chapter 16. It says, in the 17th year of Pekah, the son of Remaliah, Ahaz, the son of Jotham, king of Judah, began to reign. 20 years old was Ahaz when he began to reign, and reigned 16 years in Jerusalem, and did not that which was right in the sight of the Lord his God, like David his father. But he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, yea, and made his son to pass through the fire, according to the abomination of the heathen, whom the Lord cast out from before the children of Israel. And he sacrificed and burnt incense in the high places and on the hills and under every green tree. Then Rezin, king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, came up to Jerusalem to war. And they besieged Ahaz, but could not overcome him. At that time, Rezin, king of Syria, recovered Elath to Syria, and drove the Jews from Elath. And the Syrians came to Elath and dwelt there unto this day. So this is one of the parts of the story that are a little bit confusing, because it says that they were not able to prevail against Jerusalem, but they besieged it and could not overcome it. Whereas in Chronicles, we have the story of them taking those captives and then turning them loose. So the two theories that scholars have in regard to this are, as I mentioned, that these were actually separate campaigns. The siege was unsuccessful, but later on they had a military campaign that, had the results mentioned in Chronicles. The other theory is that, yes, the siege was not successful. They were not able to get through the walls of Jerusalem, which we had seen the last two kings heavily fortify those walls and invent. It kind of sounds like they describe some catapults and some building up of the wall, and so it's become heavily fortified. Not really through Ahaz's doing, but through his father and grandfather. And so those scholars believe, yes, the siege was unsuccessful. Those 200,000 captives that they took, those were the people that lived outside of the wall of Jerusalem. And in that regards, the military campaign was quite successful. They just simply weren't able to take the walled city. Don't really have a way of knowing which is true, but those are the majority of the opinions. So, verse 6. At that time, Rezin, king of Syria, recovered Elath to Syria and drove the Jews from Elath, and the Syrians came to Elath and dwelt there unto this day. So Ahaz sent messengers to Tilgath-Pileser, king of the Assyria, saying, I am thy servant and thy son. Come up and save me out of the hand of the king of Syria, and out of the hand of the king of Israel, which rise up against me. And Ahaz took silver and gold that was found in the house of the Lord, and in the treasures of the king's house, and sent it for a present to the king of Assyria. And the king of Assyria hearkened unto him, for the king of Assyria went up against Damascus and took it, and carried the people of it captive to Kir, and slew Rezin. And King Ahaz went to Damascus to meet Tilgath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and saw an altar that was at Damascus. And King Ahaz sent to Arijah the priest the fashion of the altar, and the pattern of it, according to all the workmanship thereof. So I got a little bit ahead of myself here. This is where the second point, where these two authors of these books told the story a little differently. In Chronicles, it says he didn't help him, but he had just listed all these invaders that he sent him money to help with, and he did not help him with those invaders. In Kings, they recorded that he sent him money, and they went and killed Rezin and took over Damascus. So even though it seems contradictory, it just seems like both authors are actually only looking at a kind of through a very narrow lens of what happened. And obviously both must have happened. And just because Ahaz temporarily received help by Damascus being taken, it didn't really help Ahaz. And at that point, he's paying tribute to the king of Assyria. And historians outside of the Bible record that, yes, the Assyrians, came and slew these people, but that was already, the reason they did this is this already aligned with their military campaign. So it was like, yeah, we'll take your money. We were planning on doing this anyway. And then after that, they didn't really help Judah any, which seems very plausible. And like I said, history outside of the Bible even records it that way. So, and then we get into this story of he went to Damascus and he sees these altars. He sees their religious system, and he brings it back to Jerusalem. Verse 11, it says, and Arijah the priest built an altar according to all that King Ahaz had sent from Damascus. So Arijah the priest made it against King Ahaz, came from Damascus. And when the king was come from Damascus, the king saw the altar, and the king approached the altar and offered thereon. And he burnt his offerings and his meat offerings, and poured his drink offerings, and sprinkled the blood of his peace offerings on the altar. And he brought also the brazen altar, which was before the Lord, from the forefront of the house, from between the altar and the house of the Lord, and put it on the north side of the altar. And King Ahaz commanded Arijah the priest, saying, upon the great altar burn the morning burnt offerings and evening meat offerings, and the king's burnt sacrifice and his meat offering, with the burnt offering of the people of the land, and their meat offering and their drink offerings, and sprinkle it upon it all the blood of the burnt offerings, and all the blood of the sacrifice. And the brazen altar shall be for me to inquire by. Thus did Arijah the priest, according to all that King Ahaz commanded. And King Ahaz cut off the borders of the bases, and removed the laver from off them, and took down the sea from off the brazen oxen that were under it, and put it upon a pavement of stone. And the covert for the Sabbath that they had built in the house, and the king's entry without, turned he from the house of the Lord for the king of Assyria. Now the rest of the acts of Ahaz, which he did, are they not written in the books of the chronicles of the kings of Judah? And Ahaz slept with his fathers, and was buried with his fathers in the city of David, and Hezekiah his son reigned in his stead. So we kind of see definitely things that it takes a while because they tell the story. I had to read it multiple times because they tell the story so differently before I started picking up some of the, okay, this is the same character, and this is when he went to Damascus and started worshiping their gods. It's just, it is one of those interesting passages in that they tell the story so differently, but both authors have the same conclusion about Ahaz, and that's that he did not what was right. Any other thoughts or comments on either of these two kings? All right. Well, that is pretty much what I have. Like I said, and I don't want to get ahead of myself. I don't know who has next week's class, but next week, this guy's son, Hezekiah, the story about Hezekiah actually goes on for quite a few chapters because he's a really good king, and he does a lot of really good stuff following his father, who was so bad and did so much evil that all of a sudden we have this good king to follow him. And unfortunately, that's a pattern that will kind of be seen for the rest of for a while now. It's just, it becomes so ironic that one generation, they just change so 180 degrees from one another. It's kind of almost more believable to me, the stories that we just are finishing, where you had Jotham's father, that he was a good king and then he became proud and got struck with leprosy because of his pride. And then his son's a good king, but the people are starting to do evil. It's like you see this decline that's just slowly happening, and then they'll come back to God. And, you know, whereas after this, we get into this story. It's like one generation. Oh, we're following God. The next generation is like, no, we're following idols and we're following heathens. It's just, it is very distinct how quick they can go from one extreme to the other, just in one generation. So,
And I think it's cool that they always mention their mom.
it is, yeah.
You know, I think the power of the mother's influence your child.
Yep, and that is, they obviously saw something of that because, you know, they don't really record female genealogy, and they're not really, the woman and the wives are not really mentioned throughout Chronicles here, but these kings, who their mother was always mentioned. So they obviously considered that. Yeah, for it to happen that much, yeah, it's like, because the only influence that I can guess from their father that they end up with are being like, I am not going to do what he did. And unfortunately, that also applied to the bad kings of, I'm not going to do what he did. But then the good kings, their sons obviously looked at what they did and were like, I'm not going to do that either. And so, right? Yeah.
An interesting thing that Matthew's doing in his gospel when speaking to the Jews,
Mm-hmm.
to a predominantly male culture driven by males, which is all good and part of God's hierarchy, but they misunderstood God's purpose behind that. He didn't say you're male because you're only male. He said, I need you to remember that you are husband and wife from Genesis 1.
Mm-hmm.
And so what's happened, unfortunately, by the time we get to Matthew, is that the Jews have, and specifically the Levites, have completely misaligned all of God's intentions for them, for their place in society and the world, and even especially how they interacted with their relationships. So when we read through this, Matthew intentionally calls attention to all the women who influenced and led the men didn't. He calls out the wife, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, the wife of, the husband of Mary, all these things. He's saying, hey, pay attention. Pay attention. You were never meant to do this alone.
Right.
So we need to really recognize in these stories that sometimes the women are stepping in, just like Silas mentioned, like in Judges sometimes. When the women are stepping in, they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, and what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be partnering together and honoring God in this relationship and doing what He needs us to do.
Well, and as was said, I mean, that's really the only explanation that makes sense on how these can change one generation to the next is the way the mother was raising the child had to be so totally different from how the father was raising the child. It's like, sure, we expect a little bit of that, you know, mom does it differently than dad, so forth. But it's like, if you're not at least somewhat on the same page and you're teaching the same thing, even if you teach it differently, it's like, wow. They obviously were not at all discussing like, oh, this is the way we're going to raise our children. What do you think we should do about this? It's like that conversation didn't seem to be happening. All right. Well, that's all I have. It's 5 minutes till, so we'll take a break and get ready for worship.
Please don't have to do that. We're still here. I leave the 16th. Well, the 15th really checked me into the. Hi. Okay, so the liquor's on it? So, yeah, it'll come in the tension. Yes.
First John 4:18.
Yeah.